In a world as interconnected as ours, a gunshot in the Middle East has a rippling effect on other nations. The Israel-Iran conflict, now escalating beyond proxy wars, seems distant to the average Ghanaian. But as history and economics show, conflicts of this nature rarely stay regional. They become global storms, and Ghana, like many other economies, stands in the path of the fallout. On Friday, June 13, Israel launched unprovoked airstrikes on Iran. The targets included senior military officials, nuclear sites, and missile infrastructure. The assault follows nearly 2 decades of Israeli warnings over Iran's uranium enrichment, which it says is central to a nuclear weapons program. Israel has long maintained it would not allow Iran to acquire that capability. Iran insists its program is peaceful and aimed at generating electricity. It says nuclear power will allow it to export more oil. Israel claims Tehran is just months away from building a nuclear weapon and has acted accordingly. Iran has since retaliated with missile launches into Israeli territory. Why should we, continents apart, worry? Well, take a listen to government.
Despite the work we have done in stabilizing the economy, Ghana is not immune from the shocks of global events. Recent events in the Middle East, which involve an exchange of missiles between Israel and Iran, have started to escalate crude oil prices dramatically. I've asked our Minister of Finance and Minister of Energy to keep a close eye on the development and model the possible impacts on our petroleum prices and prepare measures to protect the recent gains that we have made.
Meanwhile, Acting Chief Executive Officer of the National Petroleum Authority, Godwin Edoji Tamaklo, says the checks are in place to ensure that the war will have little or no impact on the nation.
So I can assure the good people of Ghana that currently, as we speak, we have enough stock or reserve to last us beyond 2 months. Beyond 2 months. Yes. And with all efforts, we are confident that we wouldn't have any problem with supply disruptions at all. We have for petrol, that's almost over 200 million liters of petrol in the country. When you look at diesel, we have in excess of 150 million liters. So these are enough stock that can last the country for a long time.
The most immediate global impact of this conflict lies in energy markets. Iran is a founding member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, the powerful cartel responsible for coordinating oil production and pricing across member countries. Any military threat to Iran's oil infrastructure or regional shipping routes like the Straits of Hormuz sends global crude oil prices soaring. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, about 20 million barrels per day, flows through this corridor. It serves as a crucial export route for oil giants like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, and the UAE, as well as Qatar's liquefied natural gas. Any threat to the free flow of tankers through this choke point spooks global energy markets almost instantly. The country relies entirely on imports for refined petroleum products, with its monthly fuel import bill averaging $400 million. A sustained rise in global oil prices will directly translate into higher costs at the pumps. President of Guta, Joseph Obeng, said some members are worried about the impact of these rising costs on the operations and profitability.
The only problem that is going to affect us is the freight charges and the prolonged delivery of our goods, because most of these shipping lines are going to reroute, because if care is not also taken, the Strait of Hormuz is also going to be closed, and most of the essential cargo come from this corridor also, and that's why we do not seek the escalation of this war, but rather pray to the leaders of the world, the UN and all that, United States, to find ways to bring ceasefire and find a dialogue or political solution to this problem.
Chief Executive of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies, Dr. Rivers says that we should expect a 10 to 15% increase in fuel prices if the war is not halted.
We expect a 10 to 15% increase if this war is not halted ASAP, because obviously there is a direct correlation between crude oil prices and the plant price. So most definitely, we're going to have that effect also on the pond prices. Should we maintain what we have today, that is the 11, 12, 13 average for fuel prices, then the city should be doing somewhere 7 cities to be able to liberate ourselves from the shock.
The Israel-Iran war is more than a geopolitical standoff. It is an economic wildfire that could sweep across economies like Ghana. The city, our national budget, inflation trends, and investor confidence all stand at risk. While we may not be able to stop missiles from flying in the Middle East, we can and must shield our economy from their economic aftershocks.
And of course, our focus this morning is on the economic fallout from distant conflicts. We've asked the question whether Ghana is at risk, because over the last 12, 13 days, many of you have been concerned about the rising price of crude oil on the world market. Well, I have been concerned. I've been checking daily to find out whether crude oil prices are increasing or reducing. We all know what this will do to the prices at the pumps. You just heard from Dr. Rivers indicating that, well, if nothing changed at the time, they'd have no option but to increase fuel prices. So you ask the question, what can be done? Because as a country, we're not insulated from external shocks. You've heard President John Dramani Mahama saying, well, I've directed the finance minister and the energy minister to look at how they can deal with this particular situation, because Ghana is consistently affected by these external shocks. The question is, how do we ensure that the Ghanaian economy is insulated from these shocks? How do we ensure that we build a resilient economy that can withstand all these shocks? Mind you, in 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine at the time, what did we see as a country? We saw inflation rising to 54%, food inflation rising to 59%, and triggering labor unrest, resulting in a 30% increase in salaries in this country. That certainly wasn't something we had planned for. But the question still remains, how do we ensure that as a country we're able to deal with this? Yes, we'll talk about the problems, we'll say it can impact us this way, but as a country, for instance, how do we ensure that we are able to have a 6-month fuel and gas reserve as stipulated in the national security document or strategy of this country, Ghana? That is our focus this morning. But even before we get into it, my name is Winston Amwa, and I am here with Winston Taki. And so Winston and Winston setting the tone for the conversation. And you can see that here. Winston Taki will be taking us through these figures as we get ready for the conversation, Winston.
There's a phrase that says that he who fails to learn from history is likely to repeat it going forward. And I want to take us back to when Russia-Ukraine war situation happened in 2022. As you can see on the slides, when it talks about the exchange rate, the forex rate, we were then at 13 cities, 1 pesos. That is when our Ghana city was experiencing some form of depreciation, and that affected our exchange rate volatility and our forex rate subsequently. And it ended up going up from 2002 to around 2023. We kept seeing the cedi fighting to survive because of the external factors.
Exactly, and this is an indication of the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The fact that here in Ghana, we had consistently talked about how we were affected, okay? This is what we saw. We saw inflation at 54.1% because we had indicated, the cost of freight, everything had gone up. You know, we import a lot from Ukraine. And so once that there was uncertainty in Ukraine, and Russia, the whole world, we said at the time, was struggling. But one of the things we didn't think about so much was that as a country, how did we ensure that at every point in time something of this sort happened, we had built enough buffers to deal with this problem? We did not. And as you would see, for instance, you see food inflation rising to 59.7% at the heart of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Because again, at the time, as I've already indicated, the conversation was that at a point that, okay, so we're talking about, our imports. We've talked about wheat from Ukraine again.
Yes.
And so that has really affected us. But that in itself is indicative of a problem. The problem is, how do we build buffers to deal with these problems, these global problems? Let's look at, the daily opening and closing of crude oil prices when the conflict started, Winston.
When the Israel-Iran conflict began, sadly, the key political risks associated with Brent crude oil began to trigger. We saw an appreciation in terms of crude oil prices rising from $70.5 to $75.18, and sadly, it's likely been projected to hit 80.2% by the blue line you see on the diagram. And just as yesterday, it is projected to have dropped because of the announcement by Trump of ceasefire, which has not necessarily been intermittent.
So you see the announcement by Trump.
Yes.
Actually easing things. Now, that's because there's some bit of certainty. Initially, when all of this started, the conversation was that, Iran produces some 3% of the world's total fuel consumption daily, produces a little over 3 million barrels of crude oil daily. Now, the total daily consumption globally is at 103 million barrels. And so we said, okay, if Saudi Arabia is prepared to do this, then there will be no problem. But as the conflict continued, there was a problem, rising to 80. The assurance, if I could put it that way, by Donald Trump when he indicated that, okay, there's a ceasefire, so call it the 12-day war, we saw, a decrease, a sharp decline in the prices of crude oil. And then today, when we checked, is at $68. But this is it for me. I've already made reference to our national strategy document.
Yes.
It says we must have at least 6 months reserve of fuel. And this includes petrol, diesel, gas. The question is, how do we achieve this? Well, according to the BOG data, total import bill per month for crude oil is at $400 million. We're going to stay here and say that when we return, we get into this must-have conversation. Our interest is the economic fallout from distant conflict, but most importantly, how do we ensure that we build the buffers that we need? How do we insulate Ghanaians from these conflicts? How do we build resilient economies that can withstand all the shocks from these conflicts? When we return, you'll be hearing from David Ofosu-Dotte, you hear from Professor Godfred Bokping, and you hear from Gabi Kumi, who is chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies. We'll be right back. Right, so welcome back, and thank you very much for staying with us. This is the Joy News channel as the Joy Business Economic Forum on Ghana at Risk, the economic fallout of distant conflicts. And we're also live on Joy 99.7 FM. And as I indicated before the break, we're joined in studio by Dr. David Ofosu-Dotte, who is Senior Partner, AB and David Africa. We're also joined via Zoom by Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School, Professor Godfred Bokping. And still on Zoom by Gabi Kumi, who is the chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies, both joining us via Zoom. So let's start in studio, and we start with David Ofosu-Dotte. Thank you very much for joining us, Doc. So let's get into it now. Let's get into, even before we get into how to build a resilient economy to withstand global shocks, I'm sure you probably would tell us why we face these shocks, and then go ahead to proffer solutions.
Well, good morning to your viewers and listeners. Winston, and thanks for inviting me to the studio to have this discussion. I noticed you wanted me to talk about how distant conflict affects us. I'm not so sure why you are making it distant only.
Because it seems so far away from us.
Well, because the conflict that affects us are not necessarily distant. Even though the one I'm sure that triggered this conversation is the very one of the Israel-Iran war, Iran-Israel war, depending on how geopolitically sensitive you are. I like to keep things simple. Let's take it that you had a situation where, let's say the government imposed a new tax as an example. Definitely it affects you as an individual.
Yeah.
So you simply have to begin to adjust as a result of that. So that event will be outside your normal planning. Now, I will give you another example. Let's say you lived in a neighborhood and 6 houses away from you, the couple there tend to quarrel a lot. And in one morning quarrel, one of the two couples set fire to the house. And the fire started raging and burned 2 houses away from you. You will certainly feel scared. Even though that fire is distant from you, you didn't cause it, it will suddenly begin to... Sure. How you are able to survive that fire will depend on a number of things. So, for example, do you have fire extinguishers in your house? Do you have fire hydrants? Can you call the fire service? And if they come, can they access the house, etc.? The point I'm trying to make is that conflicts outside Ghana, whether near or distant, are not necessarily created by us. But when they happen, they will affect us. Our ability to be able to, as it were, withstand and ensure that our economy is not disturbed depend on a number of things. And those are the things I think it's worth elaborating. So I think the first thing is how resilient are we? And resilience depends on the number of buffers that you have. So, for example, I gave the fire extinguisher example. If you don't have the buffer of a fire extinguisher, the fire is likely to affect you much more than. So let's go back to COVID, which was not a conflict, but a pandemic. Yeah. If you do recall, I think one of the things the government did at that time was to go for a $250 million, I think from the contingency fund. Yeah. What it meant is that we had a buffer of a contingency fund.
Exactly.
So without that buffer, we would have had much more challenges. What if the buffer was much higher? What would have happened is probably we would not have imposed the COVID tax. But we did impose COVID tax, which is still surviving to this day. So that's a typical example of... Now, I think before I came in, I heard you talk a lot about fuel, and many years ago, I think more than 20 years ago, there was a lot of debate as to whether we should have a strategic reserve or we shouldn't have a strategic reserve. And that was what led to the creation of what became known as BOST. But is BOST a strategic reserve entity today, or is a trader, or is a BDC like any other entity, or people are just using their facilities to import fuel? So if you have a buffer for fuel, but you are not implementing that buffer as a sustained policy over a period, maybe as a result of government changes, or as a result of policy changes within the government itself, or as a result of some circumstances that made it, as it were, exigent for the government to change its policy, then we will realize that in the long run, when, let's say, fuel prices were to go up, I'm not saying it's gone up, now, you find that what you created as a buffer previously is not there. So today, if I were to ask the question whether we have money in the contingency fund, I don't know the answer, but the last time I checked, we didn't have much money or any money in it at all. Or if I were to check whether we do have strategic reserve that will last 1 year, which was what your prelude was, we definitely don't have that. I did hear the minister talk about 2 months of fuel reserves.
Well, that in itself is problematic because if you look at our consumption, looking at a consumption of about 460 million liters, okay? But what we have per month, what we have is 200 million plus 150 million, 350 million. So that in itself is not enough, at best 1 month.
Okay, so I haven't looked at the numbers, but let's grant that it is 2 months for purpose of this discussion. What it means that it's less than the 1 year that, according to your reference to the security document...
At least 6 months.
Well, at least 6 months, yeah. It's less than that 6 months that we need to have. But that has a lot of impacts on other things, and I'll come to that very soon, because the fuel issue is not that simplistic regarding the amount of strategic reserve we need to have. But I'll come back to it. I want to focus a bit more on the resilience when it comes to finance and what leads to the major macroeconomic challenges and our inability to withstand it. Take cocoa. We've had cocoa in this country. We used to be the world leading producer for 100 years before we were overtaken by Ivory Coast. And I've said we are the threat of being overtaken by Ecuador as well. Yeah. I mean, if the Galamsey continue to deplete the cocoa forest. Why don't we have a sovereign wealth fund for cocoa? If we had a sovereign wealth fund for cocoa, then we would have realized that we could have tapped into that sovereign wealth fund either to add value or to be able to withstand some of the shocks that occur as a result of the producer price pressures that we need to pay for marketing companies, or as a result of fluctuations in the world cocoa prices. So the buffers of world funds that we create is a very critical piece of our ability to withstand, such shocks. And I'm a very big advocate of creation of more sovereign wealth funds. One of the things I thought we didn't do well in this country was the issue of uncapping statutory funds. In itself, it's not a very bad policy, but I would have thought that if we uncapped it, then the uncapping should have gone into creating a fund that the extra was going to go into. That then will help us solve problems like this. But if we uncap and we consume, we have an attitude of consuming everything, and we therefore find it difficult to. So you find that the countries like Singapore and the rest we keep admiring have reserves in the form of temasek. And as a result, whenever there is such problems, they can tap into those reserves. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be talking about. The third factor which is important for us to deal with is our attitudes. Now, and the attitudes can come in several forms. One is whether every decision we take is election-driven or long-term driven. It doesn't matter how much buffer you create or how much reserves you create. If, for example, let's assume we had a 6 months reserve, let's assume that, and it was time for election, and we decided to release all the fuel in order to push the prices down and not to share the price increases with the populace in order to win an election, that attitude itself will let us deplete the reserves. So our attitude is a very key part of what it is that makes us as a resilient people or otherwise. And also whether we are cooperative or combative in our discussion. If every topic we pick in this nation is a matter of NDC versus MPP, then we lose the effect of what it is that we can do as a nation. There are some policies we should be able to unite around, and that will, for example, affect how much fuel we reserve or how much money we keep in our buffer. So that's the. Then the other thing is our tactic. And I differentiate strategy from tactic. The tactic refers to what we do every day when something occurs. It's whether or not in making tactical decisions we are geosensitive. And it's not, the first time I'm talking about this, I keep talking about it. I don't really care as much about geopolitics as I care about geostrategy and geosensitivity. Because really what we talk about as geopolitics is nothing more than somebody's strategy that is actually becoming our geopolitics. If Israel decides to bomb Iran, the only reason they are doing it is because they are afraid of Iran getting nuclear weapons. That's what they have stated. So that strategy of bombing, and which makes Iran respond, is their strategy. It creates a number of things that we are going to talk about, and that is how do we respond geostrategically. So our policies must be quite geosensitive, and let's look at a specific event. Just a day before, let me take a bit of water.
Sure. And once you're done, you tell us how we can respond geostrategically.
Yeah, I'll talk about that, and let me illustrate. And maybe there is some science about it, but I want to see more. A day before the bombing, this was June 12th. Trump has called it the 12-day war. 12-day war. It was June 13th. But incidentally, a day before, there was a vote at the International Atomic Energy Agency as to whether Iran has breached its commitments not to, join the proliferation of the nuclear weapons. Look at the countries who voted. Russia, China, and a number of countries, but I want to mention a specific country near us, Burkina Faso, opposed the resolution. And to them, from a purely geostrategic point of view, it was not a good resolution. And Burkina Faso is clearly aligned with Russia in that regard. Now, the other countries who supported the resolution, but I want to talk about Ghana's case. We abstained from the resolution. And why did we abstain? I just went back and looked at the countries who voted for and against, and the countries who abstained. My own conclusion, I may be wrong, is the reason we abstained was more because of Morocco than any other thing. Why is that important?
Tell me.
Now, Morocco ordinarily should be aligned to Iran, ordinarily. But Iran's constitution specifically states that they are able to export revolutions, and that their definition of resolution. And therefore, if Iran is opposed to the Polisario Front, a lot of people talk about Africa being 54 countries. I always say it depends on who is in the room, because the Western Sahara originally was supposed to have a seat at the AU. So depending on who is counting, you will count 55 or 54. But because Morocco doesn't recognize the Polisario Front and their claim to Western Sahara, you notice that Ghana recently changed this position and declared support for Morocco and stopped recognizing the Polisario Front. In my view, that geosensitive decision affects whether we abstained or supported from that supported that resolution. And that's a day before. Now, the point I'm making is countries should constantly be geosensitive, whether they are in Africa or they are in. But why would Burkina Faso support? Burkina Faso supports because, opposed rather, they've signed a nuclear agreement for nuclear power with Iran. So definitely you expect them to oppose. So these decisions are not decisions which are just taken just because there is a bomb. And that's why I'm talking about this happened a day before the bombing, not after the bombing. So as a country, we should be consciously geosensitive in every decision that we take. And that affects us in how, and that's the point where we're talking about. Let's look at another example of conflict. China-US tariff. China-US tariff is not a war, but it's a conflict nevertheless. We have 10%, if my memory serves me right. But in a geosensitive country, we should be discussing how do we position our trade relationships. Remember that we have AFTA, and remember we have AGOA. And these things affect us. It affects the number of entities who are going to continue exporting. AGOA expires in September. I don't know the policy the Ministry of Trade is working on, but the last time I checked, AGOA for the rest of Africa had dropped from about 24 billion to 11 billion. Our trade from Africa to China has increased to about 270 billion, with Ghana to about 11 billion. China is looking for about 200 billion worth of organic foods. So in making decisions on trade, are we sensitive to an 11 billion potential export or a $200 billion potential export, or we are sensitive to chasing AGOA? I'm not saying we can't have both. I'm just giving you an example of how geosensitive we ought to be. Again, I'll go to one example. Today, one reason why I believe, I may be wrong, the economists and the statisticians are better answering this question, but I'm looking at it from a business perspective. But clearly, one of the countries that has become the leading center for gold is Dubai. And we export gold. We are currently Africa's leading gold producer. And gold is one reason why, in my view, we have managed to serve. And the gold board, we must commend the government for that. The CD has been stable, among other policies I believe that they are pursuing. But if this war, Iran, Israel, leads to a situation where flights are disrupted, and it already is being disrupted, that means our export to Dubai on gold is going to be affected. And once gold prices dip or rise, it affects the extent to which the CD appreciates or depreciates. It's as simple as that. So we should not restrict the geopolitical effect of these things and rather the macroeconomic effect just to oil and fuel prices. It goes far beyond that. I think I talked about the issue about the need for us to take a look at sovereign wealth funds, and I cannot, overemphasize that fact enough. I have heard Setekwe on some occasions talk about the need for us to change the name of the petroleum, the PRMA, to an RMA and national fund. So, it's one of the natural resources fund. It's one of the things I agree with 100%. But another way you can look at it, and in terms of preferring solutions to this, is to create several sovereign wealth funds. And I've mentioned cocoa as an example.
Why should we create several sovereign wealth funds?
The answer to it is
yes,
not difficult to, because life itself it functions by oscillation. There's up and downs. We are doing very well this year so far, from all indications. It doesn't mean it will always continue. Life itself is night and day. go to the Bible, 7 years of harvest, 7 years of hunger. So you will always have these ups and downs. The data you showed before we started itself shows that. Therefore, when you have good moments, that is actually the time to make provision for the bad moments which will inevitably happen. You don't wish it to happen. So sovereign wealth funds are good examples. Take Norway. Norway today, from the time oil was booming, made funds available from oil. They have over $1 trillion, and it's one of the most resilient economies in the world. They don't have to impose COVID tax. Again, same with Singapore, which I've mentioned. So sovereign wealth funds are very, very, very good examples of ways in which we can create buffer. And I'm a big advocate of that because there are several opportunities we can use to create that. So, for example, MIF, in my view, we should be adding more to those resources. That's why I made the example about uncapping. We should have rather used that as a way to create a sovereign wealth fund. But my other approach to the Secretary suggestion is you can also maintain the funds as they are, but let these funds trickle into a central fund, which gradually come to support the contingency fund or come to support the common fund as and when necessary. And that's how other countries have remained resilient. So I think there's no point in overemphasizing that.
Okay.
I think the next thing we must realize is that every conflict is context-specific. I did hear you talk about Ukraine, Russia war, Russia-Ukraine war, again, depending on sensitivity. The amount of goods we import from Ukraine and, as it were, Russia, may not, or the type of goods may not necessarily affect the economy in the same way that it's petroleum, because petroleum has a multiplier effect, as an example. So we need to take these things in this contextual sense. And in terms of the value, if at the last time I checked, our exports to Israel was about less than $10 million. So it may not affect exports, but it will affect our economy because if, for example, Strait of Hormuz is blocked, then definitely it's going to affect prices of oil and all. So I think in every response, it is important to check whether or not the context fits it. One more step, to deal with this issue, I have to look at what are the other factors which are creating a convergence. As a strategist, I always argue that no single event is enough to create all the effects. The effects of any single event itself is as a result of other things converging. Because if you take, let's say, Israel-Iran war, if we have enough money, that event itself will create a buffer. If we have enough reserve, that will create a buffer. So it's a convergence of a number of events. And I worry about convergence, which is why I talked about, why were you talking about the thing being distant? Let me give you a typical example.
Please go ahead.
Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, coup since the last 3 or 4 years, and their exit from ECOWAS creates problem for our ECOWAS exports under the ETLS. It creates a problem for Ghana's ability to continue to become a growth corridor, to Burkina Faso as a result of security reasons and many other things. But let's make it basic. A large part of the onion we consume here comes from Niger, we know that.
Yeah.
Once onion prices go up, it affects food inflation, automatic. So if we have a situation where we have less exports or imports from Niger, and we are unable to, let's say, pay through CFA, and as a result, food prices go up, and it converges with fuel prices, then it becomes worse. So it is important to look at what are the other little conflicts which may converge to make a big conflict worse. In trying to solve a problem, don't look at just the problem, because the problem itself may have other things that may create a convergence. And I actually have talked about how that may even affect our being a growth corridor, because a lot of the exports through landlocked countries come through here. The other thing to look at is internal strife. And I don't talk about internal strife only in terms of government opposition.
Okay.
I worry about internal strife within an existing government itself. It happens. And it's not a strife which is like two people are fighting. I'm not saying there's a strife in this one, but I'm saying you have a situation where one ministry decides that I have ring-fenced this is my area. Another ministry cannot come into this area. As a result, that lack of coordination may result in us having a bigger problem than. You may do this check, and I leave it to you to do that check. Over the last 15 years or 16 years or so, check the harmony between the top at the central government, at the central bank, as against the top at the Ministry of Finance. And whether or not there was harmony and coordination between the two. Because a simple internal lack of coordination between the monetary policy and the fiscal can actually create problems and make the convergence wider than it actually should be. And it may be just because, let's say, two people are not talking. I'm not saying that is what it is. I've asked you to do your own check for the last 15 or so years. What harmony existed between these two arms? And therefore, you may find that at times, the economy becomes more resilient if there is harmony between finance and the central bank than when it is not. And that simple factor at times is ignored. So as a result, you may find, let me give you let's say a simple example, that we may have a shortage of vaccines for childhood killer diseases. It's simply because the Ministry of Finance did not prioritize the budget to Ministry of Health. That happened a few years ago. Yeah. And then we had challenges of how to get these vaccines in, etc. Or simply a distant conflict like what Trump says, I have cancelled USAID or stopping USAID. $150 million loophole, it affects cheap compounds, it affects health, it affects, because immediately then the president says, try and plug the hole. That is $150 million the Minister for Finance will take from somewhere and plug this hole. So it's distant, but it affects us. And it may affect us much more if, for example, there was an earlier lack of harmony, and as a result, we didn't have critical, as it were, medicines, as an example. So we, in looking at these things, we need to look at what is the internal strife also, and how coordinated are we. The other thing is FDIs. Africa suffers from this so-called perception, and FDIs, Iran-Israel war is very far. But I have told you that when you are looking at conflicts, look at also conflicts which are near. And I'll give you just one example. It appears unconnected to Ghana. M23, Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, all that part. If that is not stopped, there is a perception of Africa risk. A typical investor in the West may not know much about Africa. And once he reads about M23 in Congo, he assumes that Congo is next to Ghana, and they classify the risk perception. How do we do that? How do we combat that? We combat that through our ability to create guarantee entities. And a typical one is, for example, if we have GIF, and GIF, that's Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, creates a guarantee entity that underwrites such risk. It reduces our reliance on sovereign rating elsewhere and enables us to underwrite some of these risks, because what has happened in African Development Bank, has been talking about this lately, is that these risks really don't actually occur. In these mega projects, defaults don't really occur. So there's a perception. And in order to reduce that perception, we need to not just complain about sovereign credit rating, but create our own guarantee entities that enable us to underwrite that risk. And the only way to do that is to recourse to the type of sovereign walls that I have talked about. Okay. So these things have a multiplier effect than, should I go on?
Just hold on 1 minute for me, David Ofosu-Dorte. Thank you very much. What we'll do, I'll get back to you, but I need to get on to Zoom because Professor Godfrey Bokwing, you still have to talk about the fuel issue. Which
I was going to come to that.
Yeah, so just stay on with that. Let me get to Professor Godfrey Bokwing to also tell us what he believes should be done in building a resilient Ghanaian economy, in building one that can withstand external shocks. Professor Bokwing, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us. Professor Bokwing, if you can unmute your microphone and go ahead, we'll be very grateful. Okay. Professor Bokwing is not, I think he can't hear me for now. So what I would do is that I'll let you talk about the fuel issue. Then I would get to the chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies to continue from there.
I think I've already mentioned a few things about the fuel issue. Luckily, the prices have dropped down again. I think the fuel issue, and by fuel, I'm restricting myself for now. I will touch it on gas shortly, to liquid fuels. Now, a lot depends on how long a conflict lasts. This conflict clearly, thanks to Donald Trump, so to speak, appears to be a very short conflict. Notwithstanding a couple of breaches over there, I don't expect it to last for long. But that may not be the only reason why fuel prices may go up. So I think as a nation, we will be better planning with the possibility of fuel international benchmark prices going up well above the 75, maybe by the third, fourth quarter of the year, for any conflict whatsoever at all. And if it happens, but look, I was trying to point out to you that the fuel prices impact would have been less if, for example, TOR was functioning.
Sure.
If TOR was functioning, and remember we did TOR recovery levy as far back as 2004, 2005, or thereabouts.
Yeah.
So I've talked about the bust reserves, which we don't have. If TOR was functioning, then we would either have been refining our own fuel, or even if we were importing fuel and refining, the cost would have been cheaper.
Okay. Hold on, I think Professor Godfred Bokwing is ready. Prof, give me just a minute for Dr. Fosu to wrap up on the fuel issue, and then we'll get back to you, yes.
So in which case, the impact would have been lesser. So I think in the long term, we need to take a look at not just bust, but at all, and whatever fuel refineries that we can. But I think the other thing we have to be thinking about more is gas. And because actually, let's hope the Strait of Hormuz is never closed. I worry more about gas there. Because remember, Qatar is a major source of gas.
Yeah.
And a lot of the gas pipelines and gas which are shipped are going through that place. If world gas prices rise, the gas we produce in this country is not enough, I mean, to fire our turbines and not our turbines, yes, the power sector, and already have a debt there. So the more the threat to gas supplies, gas in whichever form, goes up, the more likely it's going to affect our economy. Okay. So I think these are some of the things we ought to be thinking about.
I'll get back to you. I mean, I'll have some few questions for you, but let's hear from Professor Godfred Bokwing. So, Professor Bokwing, we've been focusing on how we can build a resilient economy here in Ghana that can withstand these shocks, because we seem to always talk about these shocks. Now we hear that, oh no, government can run for 4 years without expecting these external shocks. What must be done, Professor Bokwing?
Good morning, Winston, and then good morning to Dr. Fosu Dotty and then the other panelists. Good morning to our listeners.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. Yes, I agree largely with the submission of Dr. Fosu Dotty. I think if you look at our economy, just to give you a little bit of context.
Okay.
Practically from 2012, Ghana has been moving from one crisis to the other, right? From energy crisis that intensified between 2012 and 2015, and then from there we walked straight into the financial sector crisis. As soon as we were getting out of the financial sector crisis, then COVID came, and then COVID ushered us to Russia-Ukraine conflict and all of that. What do we learn from this? This is the new normal. This is the new normal. We cannot run away from it. Essentially, what this tells us is that the economy has gone through consistent shocks, and therefore the base for the economy to have resilience has been eroded, whether we like it or not. And a good way to see this is that the economy itself has been struggling to find its level in the last, since 2012. So if you look at our growth pattern has been quite erratic. So you saw where it was in 2016, then it jumped to about 8.1% 2017, and it's been quite volatile. If you look at the more recent data, if you look at the quarterly growth trend in 2024, you can see that volatility as well. And we're doing maybe 6%, then it moved to 7.5, it came down to 6.5, then 3.6, and then first quarter 2025 is gone up to 5.3 and all of that. All of this tells us that the economy itself broadly is yet to find its level in terms of a steady growth that is based on a certain anchor that is able to withstand shocks. So such unpredictability in our growth tells you that there isn't that kind of a resilience. Then again, a resilience is also about our ability to recover from negative shocks as quickly as possible. Again, look at what the data tells us. If you look at the effect of COVID, and you look at Ghana's post-COVID growth, you can see that ours has been a bit sluggish, much slower and unpredictable or erratic compared to other countries, even in the sub-Saharan Africa. So again, that tells you that our growth has been quite volatile, simply telling you the shocks and what the economy has gone through. Yes, so in terms of buffers and all of that, we haven't done quite well. Okay. And here I want to talk about some recommendations.
Please go ahead.
So the reason our growth has been quite erratic, volatile, is simply because we haven't adopted a long-term perspective to our national development. So the short-term nature, where we want the dividends as quickly as possible, really does not allow us to build the kind of economic fundamentals that will allow us to withstand shocks. So we should have a long-term view to our growth pattern. Even though you can look at the national average, and this is also something worth considering, there is regional district level differences in our country, which again doesn't help us in managing negative shocks. I'll give you an example.
Please go ahead.
When you quoted inflation for December 2022, and you said food inflation was 59.6% or so. If you look at that same data and you see the regional differences, okay, in terms of food inflation, in fact, whilst Greater Accra probably we're looking at maybe, or our national average 59, some regions in Ghana were experiencing food inflation in excess of 70% year on year, and the rest of them. So even within Ghana, the shocks, the regions do not react in the same way. There are differences across districts, regions, and the rest of them. So it's not just withstanding in terms of external shocks and the rest of them. We should also be looking at that kind of regional balance, and so that the shocks do not disproportionately.
How do we do that? Professor Bokwe, now that you make that point, I'm interested in that before you continue. Let's just address this before you continue. So how do we do that? Because certainly we know that some regions are affected more than the others. So how do we deal with this discrepancy?
Yeah, so it's about policy. If it's so, and I want to start from here. We don't use the granular data, the micro data, to inform national policy formulation and implementation. And that is why some regions are more exposed compared to others. If you look at inequality, poverty dynamics, and all of that, you see these differences manifesting hugely. If you look at what Ghana Statistical Service has done in the last couple of years, I would say maybe in the last 12 years, 15 years, there is sufficient data, granular data at the regional district level that should guide our policy formulation and implementation. Otherwise, we are missing out broadly. And the fact that some regions are affected more than others in itself can destabilize the country going forward. So those are the things that we need to look at. The basic issue, and I agree with Dr. Fosu Dote, if you look at the basic issues, the channel of transmission of some of these negative shocks, the direct one is food. Food. Even though we talk more about food sovereignty and the rest of them, our food sustainability relies so much on the global supply chain, regional supply chain stability, and the rest of them. So when there are shocks, either if it passes through the fuel channel, its impact in transportation and food inflation is very clear. Because if you look at the data, our food inflation, quite a certain percentage of that is largely also because of lack of fiscal connectivity. Okay, within Ghana, across the regions and the rest of them, transportation alone could explain more than 25% of price variation in the rest of them. So I think we should have a clear policy. We don't build resilience over a 2-year period. A national approach with long-term perspective that allows us to establish the building blocks that allows the country to still maintain some steady growth, okay, even in the midst of some of these crises. For now, I would say that we haven't seen the impact manifesting through the established channels like world oil price and the rest of them. But if these things persist, if they persist, it will have implications. You could see directly that government decided to shelve the implementation of the one Ghana cedi fuel levy. I'm sure they did so given the conflict between Israel and then Iran and the rest of them. Of course, I'm anticipating that perhaps going forward, we'll revisit that. Because it's not only that it affects, it will even also affect government revenue envelope and the whole outlook about planning and for a more sustainable level. Those are the things we need to look at. So the biggest focus for me should be on agriculture. Agriculture, agribusiness, and agro-processing. Because if you look at the shocks, the negative shocks, either from world oil price, commodity, and the rest of them, over a long period of time, the data tells us that the impact is felt more through food inflation. Because if it passes through oil, the export price goes up, you see it impacting transportation, you see it impacting food price, and the rest of them. So we should look at our food, agriculture, agribusiness, and agro-processing in that area effectively. It's a very direct way of building resilience. Again, I'll give you an example. If you look at the effect of COVID in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana's food inflation actually went up higher than any other country, largely on the average. In fact, within the first 8 months of 2022, our food inflation on the average went up in excess of 100%. And that was why the World Bank was telling us that the inflation that we saw pushed in excess of 800,000 Ghanaians into poverty. That is not the only thing. If you look at the data, the granular data, not only just poverty at the lower end, lower middle income poverty, upper middle income poverty also went up sharply, simply because of inflation, driven largely by food inflation. So you build resilience more also from that angle. If you understand the analysis, the channel of the transmission, then you want to look at where you can address that effectively. And this could be a low-hanging fruit for government. We have said it, that we need to pivot our economic transformation and productivity growth from agricultural, agribusiness, and agro-processing. That will create jobs. That would improve the income levels of people. Once you're able to do that, you are also enabling the resilience of your people to those shocks, not only in terms of government revenue envelope and the rest of them, but at the household micro level, you will also be protecting them. So we need to look at that angle effectively. The other thing we should also look at, if you look at the granular data, is that because of lack of connectivity, we are not only talking about lack of connectivity within Africa, within the African continental free trade, but Ghana has a huge lack of fiscal connectivity across regions. And that itself is a national security threat. Look, if something major happens in Accra right now, the escape routes are very limited. Either you want to say you want to run to Kumasi, you want to run to Volta region or whatever, there are practically no roads. So the lack of fiscal connectivity, poor roads in Ghana, itself does not help our resilience and all of that. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
It's sometimes much easier and cheaper for our middlemen to import foodstuffs, either from Burkina Faso and those other regions, than within inland, moving it from Brong-Ahafo or moving it from other places because of simply lack of fiscal connectivity. It's so expensive. Look, if you tell yourself, Winston, that you want to go to Kumasi right now, probably you may not arrive, or you arrive much, much late. There is no resilience from that perspective. Look, and I've said this before, when we talk about economic transformation, and you look at it both from structural transformation and then productivity transformation or growth, the basics, we don't have it as a country. We practically don't have roads, whether by rail, road, or whatever. We don't have that. Once you don't have that, you cannot talk about resilience. You cannot talk about economic transformation and productivity growth, because moving factors of production from across regions, districts, it's so restricted. You cannot, unless we look at some of these things fundamentally, we will not make the much needed progress. Let me give you an example. If you look at the growth story of China and the starting point, roads, rail, train, bullet train, and the rest of them, basic. Every country needs to have that basic, because the larger portion of economic activity, and when we talk about economic activity, is movement. It's movement. Okay, so once we do that, then we can also look at maybe within the continent, because sometimes the continent is exposed to some of this negative shock because of also lack of connectivity within the continent, moving goods across countries here and there. Sometimes just to export to some countries in Africa, it first has to go to Europe for it to be redirected here and the rest of them. The other important thing to look at is to look at the energy sector. So without an efficient, reliable, predictable energy that is also less costly, you cannot talk about resilience. You cannot talk about, because the idea is that with minimal shocks, either from external or within, most of these enduring national institutions, call them building blocks, are not there, and therefore the pass through to consumers is then direct, because there are no shock absorbers along those lines. So I know that some of this is not something that we can do in a month or 6 months and the rest of them, but I think that we should have a broader conversation about our growth pathways that is more resilient and sustainable, resilient to shock and the rest of them, because where we are heading towards, we cannot run away from these negative shocks. We have practically been moving from one crisis to the other. It's either Russia, Ukraine, or it's Israel and this and the rest of them. It's part of the new normal. If you look at the geopolitics that we are into now, and even as countries also try to future-proof their economies against the rise of Trump and the rest of them, what we know now is a considerable level of unpredictability, from global geopolitics to economic fragmentation and the rest of them. All of these things also have implications for foreign direct investment flows, portfolio flows, and then aid reasonably. Because if you look at the role that aid has played, even on the continent, that is not going to be there going forward. Okay, so you see Europe affirming their decision to scale up defense spending up to 5%. Where are they going to get the money from? Chances are that they will roll back on their philanthropic activities, aid, and the rest of them. Even though aid itself has been quite volatile, not there over the years, it's going to get worse. So we should look at all these things in a kind of a national risk assessment for us as a country, and see where we need to start from, where are the low-hanging fruit as a country, and the rest of them. And as I indicated earlier, agriculture, agribusiness, agro-transformation will be a direct way of cushioning the people of Ghana, the consumers largely, because food inflation has been one big issue for all of us. The factors that affect that, you can link that to transportation, you can link that to so many other factors.
Great. Please hold on for us, Professor Godfred Bokping, still live here on the Joy News channel. It's the Joy Business Economic Forum, and our focus this morning is on the economic fallout of distant conflicts, well, maybe conflicts in general. We're finding out how we can build a resilient Ghanaian economy, how we can insulate ourselves, how we build the buffers that we so much need. I'm going to get to Gabi Kumi, but before I get to Gabi Kumi, Dr. Fusudote, you were nodding when Professor Bokping was talking about the things we needed to do. I don't know if you want to make a quick point before I get to Gabi. Yes.
I think we have so far, as a nation, not been prepared to address the fundamental problems. And the fundamental problems are both simple and complex at the same time. Simple in the sense of what causes it, and complex in the sense of how we have allowed politics to affect it. And I just want to pick just the 2 points. It's totally overlooked. And I've written papers on this in the past. I don't know whether you know this. I originally was a transportation planner.
Sure, I know.
Yeah. And one of the pieces I wrote won an award at the University of Lancaster relating to this very topic. Actually, when you go to the farm gate for food, the food price is very low. But by the time it gets to the consumer, at the district, at the urban centers, and in Accra, it has multiplied by 5 times. And that's what Prof was talking about. Yeah. And it's not just the simple issue of lack of roads. No. It's a very complex problem of how our attitudes and our system work. There is something called market queens.
Yes.
These market queens decide how you can eat. It's as simple. They control who plants tomatoes, who brings plantain to the market, and all that. It's possible for a market queen, for example, to decide that a particular product will not arrive in a particular district. They also control who hauls the food, including the transportation. And because they fund these things, they have a complete control over the price, and we need to address that as a nation. This is how we price our food. Now, when you just stay and then you come and pick what the Statistical Service will publish, in the CPI, you may find that the amount of spend we put on food, maybe, I don't know the figure, let's say it's 40%, and let's say another 30% to fuel, and another 10% to rent, as an example. But these 3 are very heavy, and the attitude, so if a market queen is controlling how food gets to the urban center, indirectly, they are controlling the price. Now, as if that matter was only market queens. No, we come to the transportation. And this is where I said my piece won an award. GPRCU, Progressive Transport Owners Association, ProTour, Ghana Road Transport Council now, and then Ghana Road Transport Coordinating Council, which puts all of them together, and the Ghana Road Haulage Association. Each of these are cartels in their own right. In fact, until about a few years ago, when Act 863 was passed to repeal it, we used to have something called the PNDC Law 317, which empowered GPRTU to control terminals. So they decide exactly who can haul food. The prices of transportation is not as a result of forces of supply and demand. It's not true. It's very easy for you to be taught in the classroom that prices are determined by forces of supply and demand. That is not what happened to our transport. It is not. It is purely a cartel deciding how much to price it. And that is why any time that there is fuel increase, they will say, I'm increasing fuel by 15%. At times, they correlate the increase in fuel to the increase in fare. Now, if you take a typical bus as an example, you spread the cost over the number of people.
Exactly.
And therefore, it's not be a direct proportion of correlation.
Yes.
And this nation forgets history. This is not new. In November 1990, after a lot of debate, this nation consciously made it. I'm talking about 1990, 35 years ago, made a decision to actually deregulate fare pricing and remove the control of the terminals and give it back to the district assemblies. After deregulating fare prices, as soon as we got into another crisis, we decided that, let's now create GPRTU. And what happened? They brought all the 4 entities together and now created a Ghana Road Transport Coordinating Council, made it an even bigger cartel. And government after government has left it as it is. So it is, now I've talked about food. Talk about your normal transport, the trotro person. When you go to a typical trotro station, you don't choose which vehicle to join.
Exactly.
They call it scale. And Article 21 of the GPRT Constitution, they decide the scale and they decide who to give a favor to. So I can give you a simple statistics. Way back, one trotro could do about 6 trips between Accra and Tema. Trip frequencies have reduced to 2. So they are going less. It's a full load factor concept. They are controlling the prices of food that comes from the rural areas. They tell us how much, and then combined to the market queens, there's a convergence. So unless we want to address this fundamental, simple problem.
How do we address it?
I will give you this very, very, these things are not difficult if we want to face facts. Deregulate transport. Now, I'm taking you 103 years back, 103. The statement by Lord Lugard, who was governor of Nigeria during the colonial era. He read a statement. He read a speech and said, the solution to Africa's socio-economic development can be summed up in one word: transport. That is still true. The typical human being wants to eat and connect with each other. Now, the cost of transport is not increased as a result of lack of investments by people, but it is increased when people have a control over where we board transport. Because transportation by its very mode, this is pursuant to the so-called Cape Town Convention, must come to a stop for some people to alight or board. So if you give control of terminals to GPRTU, Protua, GRHA, that's exactly what you have done. The World Bank funded the development of Tema Station as an example, and immediately we handed it over to these people. To the extent that we backed it with the law, which is now repealed.
So if you say we deregulate it, I mean, are you saying that the fare should be such that there's competition?
I'm giving you a series.
Okay.
No, we have deregulated, quote and unquote, but it is controlled by private sector. So it's private sector. The moment you are sitting down with a cartel to negotiate how much they can increase fuel price and how much they cannot increase fuel prices, you have just shifted it from a public sector to a private sector. Do you understand?
Yeah.
When I say deregulate, there is the assemblies who by law under LI 1961 have control over the terminals. They should have control. They should allow everybody to operate there freely, and no association should be given control over the terminals. The law is repealed, but the control is still there.
Okay.
2, there was an attempt to introduce Accra, for example, GAPTI, and the World Bank has been technically struggling to do a similar one in Kumasi. GAPTI, by licensing lanes, etc. You know about Ayololo and the rest. Why did it fail? Because it's very cartel, undermine them. That's one of the reasons. So you can license a route because government forgets that government can, as a result of its ability to introduce transportation, bring prices down. Any city which functions, which is resilient, just imagine London without the buses and the train. Any city which functions requires government to play some role in transportation to allow the masses to move. And because we don't have mass transportation options, people are forced to buy cars. And as a result, we congest the city, we pollute the city, etc., 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 etc. So I'm talking about the assemblies playing their real role, which is already spelled out in law. And secondly, addressing the issue of post-harvest cost build-up of food prices. A lot of food actually gets rotten in the villages, and we suffer a huge amount of post-harvest losses because the food is not being transported to where it is supposed to be consumed, because some queens are controlling whether it should be transported or not. These are the fundamental issues, and we need to address them and deregulate it. That is how come under the previous government, a time came when the Ministry of Agri, if you remember, decided to create what do you call it? They were selling plantain and other things. How come their plantain was cheaper than the others? Because they were transporting it through vehicles that they control. That's what is happening. Yeah. And you need to address this.
Yes, but the market queen concept, before I get to Gabi, I mean, how do we deal with that? Because this looks like, you've called it a cartel, which is the case. They wield so much power. How do we break that?
First, you cannot break it if the market queens themselves belong to political parties. It's just like asking me, how do we take hawkers off the street? The hawkers come according to which political party and which MP is being elected and not. So these queens and the rest are aligned to a political party. And at times we think these people are not, they are very sophisticated. They have their reason for joining political parties. I think the way to do it is to meet with them. You know, we have an economy which is actually, for want of a better word, confused. In one breath, we manage the economy on the basis of modernized principles. But in another breath, we operate the economy down there with very traditional principles, which is not, as it were, aligned to the modern principles of managing an economy. So I think we need to have meetings with them. We need to have policies as to how to reduce their power. We need to have situations where people can go to the farm gate multiple. And the way to do that is to make sure that the farmers have some funding direct from government or through some channels that enable them produce, because they rely on the market queens to produce. It's just like the way the cashew business is controlled. Because if you take your funding from some people from a different country, then they are the people you are going to sell to. So they don't have access to these things. If we ensure that they do get it, and we, as it were, liberalize the extent to which people can go and take it and sell, and we allow people to also introduce, let me talk about the last part. Go to just Côte d'Ivoire. Why is food inflation in Côte d'Ivoire not as high as that of Ghana? And those were the differences Prof. Poppin was. Because in Côte d'Ivoire, every food you buy is weighed on a scale.
Yeah.
Here, the person puts 3 items in his or her finger and tell you the price. So our way of pricing itself is not modernized. We have to train these people to consciously be able to weigh things, etc. And you can do it. You don't have to go to school to have a degree to weigh something. These are the fundamental things we need to do, because that is how we live as a people. You eat fufu, and if the fufu is controlled by a market queen, food in price will go up. If the transportation is controlled by a private sector operator, food inflation will go up. It doesn't matter the statistics that you churn out.
Great points there. I'll get back to you, Dr. David Fosu-Dorte. I would also get back to you, Professor Bokwing, because the points you make on the Joy Business Economic Forum on the economic fallout of distant conflicts, and most importantly, how we can build resilient economies. You're thinking long term. You've talked about starting with agriculture, agribusiness, agro-processing. David Fosu-Dorte has also talked about breaking that cartel, the market queens, and the private sector handling our transportation of products from our farms, for instance. If we don't do that, we can't deal with food inflation. But one thing we need to look at is fuel. Let me say that we're also live on Joy 99.7 FM. My name is Winston Amwa. Let me bring in Gabi Kumi, who is chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies. Gabi, we've been talking about fuel, and we've asked the question, strategic reserves. NPA has talked about how we have some 200 million liters of petrol, 150 million liters of diesel. Add that, you get 350 million liters. Monthly consumption is about 460 million. So that in itself tells you that we can't even survive 1 month. But let's just accept that and say we can do 2 months. In doing 2 months, we fall short of the national strategy, document that says, national security strategy document that says at least 6 months. How do we build these reserves, Gabi?
Thank you very much, Kristen. And I don't know why you don't want me to continue listening to this great lecture from Dr. Fosu-Dorte and Prof. I think they've done a lot of good to the topic. But having said that, I'll also add the level that I can. Let me state that there was a committee, a downstream review committee put together by the Minister of Energy, and they've been working for the past 3-4 months. And coincidentally, today they are meeting to finalize the report at the ministry, and it really captures a lot of these things that we are talking about today. This morning too, I heard you challenging the figures put forward by the Chief Executive of National Petroleum Authority. This tells all of us that the days when the politicians speak and it's taken as the gospel truth is gone. Whatever you put out there, be sure that it's going to be challenged and it's going to be verified. For us, the fact that an increase in crude oil price almost immediately affects our pump price simply tells us that we have no reserves at all. Because what does reserves normally do? Your reserve is normally supposed to cushion you in times like these. But if there is a shock, there is a sharp increase in the price of crude oil, and almost immediately, within a matter of days, you feel it at the pump. It tells you how vulnerable we are as a country. Let me also state that, like I did indicate, I'm enjoying the lecture, but I'll be very brief so that Dr. Dorte, who happens to be my in-law, I'm married in the same house with Dr. Dorte. So we are married from the same family. In fact, his wife and mine are cousins.
Okay.
That is for that matter. So he's a man I have great respect for. And of course, he's a role model. Having said that, let me state that 6 months of strategic reserve means that holding up to about 3 billion liters of petrol and diesel in strategic reserve.
Yes.
And if I may have to add LPG, then you need about 180,000 tons of LPG to be able to secure the country for the next 6 months. Ghana currently does not even have that much in fuel storage infrastructure. So we don't even have the infrastructure to hold that kind of volumes. The total storage infrastructure in Ghana, assuming you add storage tanks and thermal oil refinery, is just about 1 million cubic meters, which is approximately 1 billion liters of storage capacity. And that is just about 2 months of our needs. Boss own storage capacity is just about 400,000 cubic meters, which is about 4 million liters out of this national storage that we have. To increase our strategic reserve to 6 months will likely be a long-term goal, assuming that is something we even want to consider now. Currently, Boss levy generates about 48 million cedis monthly, or equivalent of about $4.8 million. Even if we have 6 months of storage capacity already available in the country, Boss will need about $3 billion to buy 6 months of strategic fuel reserves. And like I did indicate, the Boss levy is just about $4.8 million. But if even assuming we have the storage capacity and we say we want to buy products to store, we need about $3 billion to be able to do that. So you can imagine what $4.8 million can do.
Okay.
Assuming that the Boss levy is used by government to secure strategic fuel reserve bond, and the payback period will be over 50 years. So I'm just trying to really put out the gap in financing that we have in our attempt to have that 6 months strategic reserve. Given this, our view is that government and NPA in the short term focus more on building a second CBN facility to make it easier for vessels to discharge product quickly and eliminate the bureaucratic nature of the Lacan allocation. Normally you have vessels coming on shore, and it takes them about a week to discharge because we don't have enough discharging facilities for petroleum product. So it makes the discharge very inefficient because you need to be in a queue to be able to discharge products. So once we have another CBM, it will make discharging of product into the country quicker, and that will bring some efficiency in the discharge and distribution of petroleum products in the country. In the medium to long term, however, we can consider investment in more storage infrastructure, especially outside the Tema enclave, to ensure more storage security to the country outside the Tema enclave.
Okay.
As we speak now, I think about 85% of our storage facilities are located in Tema. And that's one alone is not good enough. We should spread the tank farms across the country so that should in case in an unlikely event that there is a problem in Tema, we are all in deep trouble. So there's a need for us to look at not concentrating all our infrastructure in the Tema enclave.
Okay. But Gabi, I'll get back to you shortly because you make a point that scares me also. Before I get to Professor Bock, let me get Dr. David Ofosutode's point views on this. Because we're talking about the national security document that says, at least, and I've done my checks, and that's the case. I have the document here. I'll quickly pull it out. That's the case. 6 months of strategic reserves, but we don't even have the storage.
But it's again, it goes back to the issue of attitudes, politics, and lack of consistency. And without going into too much details, I have been involved in this in one way or the other, where among other things, I was to help structure how we do get the strategic reserve. What Gabriel and his in-law, as he said, is saying is very true. But there are two arms to it.
Okay.
One, you first need to build the storage. And the first set of storage that was built way back, in fact, I think it was built by the Koreans around Tema. That was the first set of storage that when I say we, I mean this nation. This is way back in PNDC days. Now, if we need that amount of storage, to structure it, you need to look at the infrastructure component and who pays for it. Will there be people who will pay for it? Yes. The answer is yes. How do they get their money? You don't treat the storage as reserve that you keep. You treat the storage as reserve that you float. So if you need that many billions of barrels, you actually ensure that at a specific point in time, you have actually loaded. That means that if you had that sovereign fund, contingent fund, that recourse you decide that this is how much this will cost. We store fuel, let's call it day one, or we store it over a period. But you are floating it in the sense that anytime you release fuel up to a certain point, you replenish it. So your imports or your production is not going to be the one you are selling. You are selling your releases from the one that you have stored at some point. And there is a margin that you use to pay those who build the infrastructure, and you can share the cost. Okay. This is one strategic area that government, for example, may decide that, look, I want to give a tax exemption here because there's a multiplier effect. That way, we don't suffer this resilience. But this plan was done. I was part of the team who put it together. But at the end of the day, policy inconsistency, a minister changes. At times, just a minister. And then this is not implemented.
Just a minister?
In fact, policies change more by a minister change than by a government change.
Really?
I can give you the data. Policies within one government are more...
The minister is only a representative of the president.
Yes, because as soon as the minister comes, he comes with fresh ideas and he thinks his colleague minister, unless you have a president who insists that there is continuity. Ministers change their colleague policies more. They come and as if it is a new... So these things has happened over and over and over again. And this problem is solvable. Now, there is something we need to add to this.
Okay.
If you permit me.
Please go ahead.
There is a tendency for us to think that everything we do must be funded by the government. Unluckily for us, or maybe luckily for us, we have the $250 million limit with the IMF when it comes to capital expenditure. And luckily for us, it appears we are enjoying good times and we have some amount of money now. What I recommend is we don't think that we must put everything at the center. You know, one of the challenges I think the previous government faced was again the uncapping. Now, when you put money at the center, it's okay, you can fund, but I've told you life is oscillating. When the bad times come, you won't have money to fund. Any infrastructure that is commercially viable or has the potential to be commercially viable, whether it's roads, whether it's fuel storage, whether it's ports, pass it to the private sector. Because what the public sector seems to do is to think that now I have money to fund it. Yes, but you run short of the money. And the public sector is never efficient when it comes to funding these things. And we forget that when we uncap and we put things at the center, we have also put a liability at the center. Why don't you release the liability, release whatever funding you can, and as a result of this, we actually pass PPP laws in this country and everything, but we don't allow it to work because we enjoy funding things at the center. I'll give you one example and you can let the others come in. You know, Prof. Bevin talked about connectivity.
Exactly.
And I answered only one side of the connectivity, the operational side. The infrastructure side is even worse. Accra Kumasi, let me give you just one example. Accra Kumasi Toll Road. The first time I advised on that road was in 1999.
Wow.
Yes. And I'm talking about over 30 years ago. 1999. That's the first time I advised on that road. Okay, almost 30 years.
Yeah, 26 years ago.
Yes. The attempt to privatize it, I have come to talk about that in 4 times under 4 different regimes. Each time you go forward and somebody thinks, oh, he has a brilliant idea and he changes it. And on 2 occasions, and this is court issue, so I can talk about it. Somebody walked away with $8 million coolly just because the design they had made for the private sector was actually passed on to another private sector entity because the minister changed.
Okay.
Yes, this matter is in court, or was in court.
Okay.
Judgment debt, 8 million. Another one, 15 million.
Another judgment debt?
Oh, yes.
All in relation to the Accra Kumasi Road?
In relation to the Accra, and these are public issues. Somebody goes to court and walks away with money. Because at each time, we think we have some brilliant idea, and what we want to do is different from what has existed before. And what people never do is to consult people who understand these things and ask questions. So as a result of that, you would never have done Accra Kumasi toll since 1999. The first design was in 1999. I contributed not only to the design, but to the structuring, etc. And that's just one example I'm giving you. Now, this government has made certain promises. Big push. 24 hours an infrastructure component. Voter a region as an SEZ. The president has talked about these things. These are public information.
Yeah.
How is it going to be funded? Unless we identify the commercial aspects of it and pass it on to the private sector, yes, government can do it, but the burden on government will create fluctuations and challenges which will converge with an Israel-Iran war. Anything, as for disruptions from outside, it's just like the fire sits away from your house that I talked about. You can't predict it.
Yeah.
It can be COVID, it can be anything. It is the internal measures you put is much more important than the external factors.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Fosu-Dortey. When we return after this short break, we'll be getting to Professor Godfrey Bokwing. This is the JoyBusiness Economic Forum. Our focus this morning is on Ghana at risk, the economic fallout of distant conflicts. When we return after this short break, we're going to get into a conversation with Professor Bokwing also. He would also tell us what he thinks we can do differently. You know, Gabi Kumi, who is chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies, has painted a very bad picture, okay, about how much we'd need. Well, David Fosu-Dortey has tried to, show you that you can do this easily. What does Professor Bokwing think about this? We're live on Joy FM. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and thank you very much for staying with us. This is the JoyBusiness Economic Forum on Ghana at risk, economic fallout from distant conflicts. And this morning we're joined by Dr. David Fosu-Dortey, who is a senior partner, AB and David Africa. We've also been joined by Professor Godfrey Bokwing, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School, and Gabi Kumi, who is chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies. And before the break, I promised that we're going to be hearing from Professor Godfrey Bokwing. So, Professor Bokwing, let me bring you at this point, because the point that Gabi Kumi makes about petroleum is led to something that actually surprises me. Well, many of us may know this. You, I'm sure, would know this. But he talks about the fact that, look, we're talking about storage, strategic reserves, 6 months. And currently, which means you would need about 3 billion liters of fuel. What we can store currently is just 1 billion. So a lot has to be done. David Fosu-Dortey has been telling us what we can do. But let me get your thoughts on this before I get to you on issues about connectivity and all that you raised during your submission.
Well, thank you very much. I think Dr. Fosu-Dortey had said the right thing. I think if a country, its own risk assessment and strategy, decides that these are the building blocks for national resilience to shocks that are clearly not avoidable, unpredictable, then it's about also finding more appropriate strategic ways of raising the revenue. And I think it has to be done over a certain period of time and all of that. That is how I see it. Until then, for lack of this, what is going to happen and what has happened over the years? In fact, if you look at the data, Winston, if you look at the economic boom during Nkrumah's time, a little bit of history, I don't want to say if you remember.
Because I wasn't there.
Yes, because you were not there. If you look at the fact that inflation was very low, practically low until 1965, thereabouts, when we introduced the CD, the major shock Nkrumah had to contend with was commodity prices that declined significantly. That already tells you if you build an economic transformation that is heavily based on a single product or industry, you are vulnerable in the first place. So many decades after that, we are still talking about the stability of our currency that is significantly determined or anchored on gold, export earnings. That itself tells you there's no resilience there. With the slightest shock to that, we are exposed and all of that. So it's about striking a good balance, building buffers, building sovereign wealth, sinking fund. They have their own trade-offs. They have their own trade-offs in terms of opportunity cost that we need to manage because we don't have the basic building blocks for resilience, for certain level of luxury that someone can expect from us. And here, let me give you a couple of examples.
Okay.
Our analysis of the impact of COVID-19 shocks, crisis over the years, the differences, right, in terms of the marginality from one country to the other actually has more to do with the internal shock absorbers countries have built. And at this stage, we are talking about those at the macro level, fuel, because fuel plays a
Hello, Professor Bokwe. Yes, go ahead.
The fact that Ghana more often will become more, yes.
We lost you briefly, but you go ahead. We're listening. Go ahead.
Sorry, is it better now?
It is better now. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead. We're listening.
Ghana will become a bit more exposed simply because of vulnerabilities in our own economy. Sorry, is it better now?
Yes, please, it's better. Go ahead.
Because of lack of resilience in the basic building blocks of our economy. That is where it comes to. The bigger pictures and all of that, we can talk about that. And I think Mr. Kumi also mentioned about fuel, because fuel plays a key role in so many things that we do and all of that. But I'll give you a couple of examples here. Since independence, the sustainability of our economy is still based on primary commodities. There's no way you can talk about resilience within that context. More than 70% of Ghana's export earnings are still driven by primary commodities. In fact, the same percentage, you can see that from the literature right from independence. From independence, more than 70% of our export earnings were still driven by primary commodities. We are still talking about the same, almost the same percentage now. When we say we have done well, it's more of the same. So how do you talk about resilience? Your economy is only resilient because the negative event we are seeing now tends to disproportionately benefit gold. And therefore, we are getting some gains from there. What if the crisis had come from the perspective of commodities? What would have happened to us? So over the years, decades, we have not really structurally transformed this economy. We haven't diversified this economy. Earlier, I spoke about the lack of fiscal connectivity, transportation, and the rest of them. So if you are determining national resilience for crisis management and strategy, the building blocks goes beyond just focusing on one product or industry. You are looking at diversifying your economy so that shocks in one line of the economy, once you lose in one line of the economy, you also gain from another line of the economy so that your resilience is a bit more stronger going forward. Then you're also talking about social cohesion, right? Social cohesion. And whilst you are doing all of this, you are doing so to ensure regional balance. There is a lack of regional balance in our development strategy. And once it happens that way, you realize that when there are crises, we have internal migration because the impact becomes more in certain districts and regions, and therefore there's a migration to urban and peri-urban areas where there's unlimited infrastructure and the rest of them. All of this, we need to look at that broadly. And apart from that, we're also even looking at national or natural disasters. We don't have the shocks. With minimal rain in Accra, every place is flooded. You can't be talking about resilience. So I think that this is a conversation we need to sustain. And we're also talking about governance, effective governance, transparency, disclosure, direct investment, portfolio flows, and private capital. Winston, it will interest you to note that the reason we talk about lack of funding and challenges in Africa is not because Africa doesn't have resources. In fact, Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. Africa is the only continent, and Ghana for that matter, where water flows upwards and there's redistribution of wealth. It's simply because we have not built governance institutions that fosters trust in government and government institutions that allows us to plow back our own funding to finance our development outcome and own the development process. So at the end of the day, even if you check in Ghana here, and that is why some of us were so much against domestic debt testing. If you check in Ghana here, the upper middle income class are essentially looking at how they can externalize their wealth, invest offshore as a form of security and the rest of them. Meanwhile, it's the same country that needs resources to invest in critical infrastructure and the rest of them. So in building resilience, it's not like a big ticket project you want to look at. You are looking at a gamut of factors, building blocks that must come together to build confidence, national cohesion, from governance to product innovation to technology and all of that. All of that must work together and reinforce each other. Then you are saying that you are building national resilience. Otherwise, we can talk about funding maybe strategic reserves with oil and the rest of them. If the micro regional level issues are not addressed with, we will still be affected, impacted more, and Ghanaians will be exposed. Okay. So that's why I'm saying that we should adopt an effective economic governance approach, infrastructure transformation, product diversification, structural transformation as a package to resilience rather than an isolated case of, let's say, strategic reserves with oil. I'm not saying it's not important, but you can have the oil. The lack of fiscal connectivity, the cartel in the transportation, and all of that will take a lot away from cushioning the average Ghanaian. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Godfrey Bokping. Let me get to Gabi Kumi. We'll wrap up with Dr. David Ofosu-Dortey in studio. Gabi Kumi, finally, I know you want to talk about how we can also, get this. But, when you made the point that I said I was shocked, one of your industry players has been telling me, I should ask you, how come you have just one discharging point? Maybe you would have to focus on that, and then you move to how government can do this with the private sector, Gabi.
Yes, that is a problem that industry have been hammering on for a very, very long time. I mean, those points are developed by government. It's not private. And we have been calling for an additional CBM for a very long time. So I think this is about time we need to take a look at that and actually get that one done. Because we believe that with that, product can flow in very, very, very quickly. And, like Dr. Ofosu-Dortey said, once you have very frequent flow of product, you don't necessarily need to have too much of stock. But if you don't have that, if you don't have your product flowing in, and vessels will have to queue for a very long time, attracting the demurrage charges and all that, it all makes the whole process very inefficient. And at the end of the day, it increases your cost. So we will continue to appeal. As I did indicate, it's one of the very strong points that the Chamber made to the Downstream Review Committee. And we are very hopeful that they will look at that and then practicalize that so that we will have quite a quicker and faster flow of products into the country.
Thank you very much, Gabi Kumi, who is chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies. Dr. Vosudote, finally.
I think I will re-echo what both Gabi and Prof have said. And if you look at it, essentially, they are summarized it in two ways. One is you need to make decisions that have got multiplier effect. And if you take the transportation aspect that Prof talked about, for example, that's what he's talking about, which is the same thing about the fuel that Gabi is talking about. And I'll give you an example of how you can have private sector fund this over a period. You don't necessarily having all the reserve at the same time, but nevertheless getting the 6 months. So that's the issue of decisions and projects that have multiplier effect. The other one has to do with how we ensure that other things are all done at the same time to converge. Convergence is very important because we tend to have this crisis after crisis because we solve one crisis, another crisis pop up from a different angle, and then we destroy the first solution in order to solve this one. So we need to think about it holistically. And I think we need to understand that these things affect us irrespective of what we do. For example, and this is not about Iran, Israel, but the issue about power and the debt that we have, which we have to, this debt has gone over and over and over. ESLA, we didn't put in the money, etc., and we want to industrialize and do value addition, which Prof is talking about. You can't add value when the tariff is very high. And when you don't have base load, you can't industrialize. But again, I'm saying private sector can fund this, provided government takes a look at this in terms of its multiplier effect, in terms of its convergence, and in terms of the attitude that enable us attract that capital. And these things are doable.
Of course, these things are doable. The private sector has a lot of role to play. Government also has a role to play. There must be convergence at some point in time. Otherwise, we'd actually, solve one conflict, and then we face another conflict, and would have to erode all the benefits in solving the previous conflict just to solve another. This has been the JoyBusiness Economic Forum. Our focus has been on Ghana being at risk, the economic fallout of distant conflicts. So much has been learned today, and you can see all the points on our various social media platforms on myjoyonline.com. Get onto business, and then you read all those stories. Thank you once again, David Ofosu-Dotte, Dr. David Ofosu-Dotte, who is a senior partner AB in David Africa. Thank you, Professor Godfrey Bokpin, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School, and Gabi Kumi, who is Chairman of the Chamber of Oil Marketing Companies. My name is Winston Amoa. I am head of JoyBusiness and host of the Super Morning Show. Thank you very much.